All right. Well, Tim, thank you for being with us and spending a few minutes today to do this. Grateful for your time and grateful for your ministry. Maybe just if you would just begin just sharing a quick word about who you are, where you are, what you do, what your ministry is all about these days.
Sure, yeah. I live just outside Toronto with my wife and daughter. I have another daughter who is living in Louisville, Kentucky with her husband. They're newly married. And then I have a son who's waiting for me in heaven as well. I'm an author by trade, and then I'm a pastor, elder at Grace Fellowship Church in Toronto. I've been there for 16 years, been serving as an elder for about 12, currently enjoying just a bit of a sabbatical, a few months or 6 months maybe off from serving in that way, which has been lovely to enjoy that as well. But if people have heard of me before, it's probably in relation to a blog or a book picked
Yeah.
up somewhere.
How did the blog? I don't know that I know the background here. How did your blog start? How long did it take it before it blew up and got as big as it is?
Yeah, I was talking to my wife the other day about the origin story and wondering how much we even really remember anymore. But I do know that I started it as a personal site, hence Challies.com. Um, I started it mostly as a playground just for writing and for even web design, which I was doing back in the day. But I was in a church at the time that was really getting into the church growth movement, and they started going through um, Rick Warren's material, especially The Purpose Driven Life. And so at that time, I started just writing my way through the purpose driven life because I was finding it really, I'd grown up with Reformed theology. My background was finding that really concerning or perplexing. And so I wrote my way through it. And other people started reading that material and started, interacting and engaging with it. And I guess at some point I realized, oh, I've got a blog and I'm a blogger and I'm part of this young restless reform thing. And it sort of grew up from there.
And so today, how often do you write on your site? How often do you add something new?
Yeah, I've posted something new every day for 19 years now.
Okay. I thought it'd been a long
Yeah.
time. So yeah, that's amazing. That's amazing. So you're
Yeah.
known primarily for, like you said, for the writing or the reading and book review. Obviously, you're an avid reader. Is that something that's always been true of you? Have you always enjoyed reading as far back as you recall?
Yeah, I loved reading as a kid, but that was mostly reading fiction and that sort of stuff. I probably read some missionary biographies or something. There's quite a long gap. And then in my mid 20s, I picked up reading again. And part of the reason I read so frantically in those early days was I was really playing catch up. So I was reading probably a couple hundred books a year. And a lot of that was just realizing I know so little. I'm way behind. And so, yeah, I did some really frantic reading for a few years and then started to ease off a little and get back to more rational levels.
I would assume that most people, whether they be pastors or Sunday school leaders or just believers in a church, for most people, probably their first thought is, I don't have time to read. I'm too busy, work, family, those kind of things. Can you maybe speak to how can people increase their appetite for reading? And then along with that, what would a average day of reading or an average week of reading look like for you? How do you kind of schedule and budget your
Mm.
time? You might speak to those two
It's
things.
my Sure. You just heard my smoke alarms do their monthly test there. Um, So I don't want to attach too much of a moral imperative to reading. Reading matters and reading is valuable, but the Bible doesn't command us to read books. So I think we need to be careful that we're not carrying guilt that really the Lord doesn't intend for us to carry. We are responsible, of course, to form our minds and to live in a distinctly Christian way. And that does mean we need to take in information, we need to take in knowledge, and we need to convert it to wisdom. So we're living wisely before the Lord. So reading is a great way to do that. And if you're able to, then I would encourage you to dedicate some time to reading. Honestly, if you read just little bits at a time, you'll still get through a good amount of material. If you read just a few minutes a day before bed, after you get up, when you're waiting in line, here and there in life, you can get through a fair bit. If you just listen to books while you're driving, you'll get through some good material and so on. So I think just committing yourself to the discipline of reading, seeing the value, seeing the good in it, and forming your own mind, and then working that out in love and service to others, I think can be very helpful. In terms of my own life, there was a time, I said earlier, when I was reading on a near constant basis. More recently, I've toned that down a little bit once I sort of felt I had caught up with the state of the Christian book market. So now I tend to read in the evenings, and I tend to read books that I want to let others know about. And I also tend to read books that help my own heart, help my own mind. And so the books I want to let others people know about tend to be books that are written in the last couple of years. The books that I really appreciate and the ones that really form my heart and mind and help me write better are probably written quite a long time ago. Most of them in the sort of late 1800s is where I've been camping out over the last couple of years.
Yeah. So recently you've written Seasons of Sorrow, obviously a very, very personal book and personal story. I know you've done lots of writing and interviewing and talking about that. What's a couple of things that the Lord has taught you through that, maybe continually teaching you through that? Maybe for anyone who doesn't know the background of that book, you might just share a brief word about where that book comes from. But and how is the Lord using that work in your own life right now?
Sure. Yeah, the book describes the season, the year that followed the death of my son. Nick was a seminary student at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary when he just very suddenly and unexpectedly went to be with the Lord through a cause we still don't understand and probably never will understand. And in the aftermath of that, I just had to write, just my way of processing what had happened. And a few months in, I sort of thought, well, maybe there could be a book here. Maybe I could collect these writings and put them together into something. And that book came out a number of months ago now, and the response has been really, really affirming. Especially, all of us endure losses, so all of us need to ponder heaven, death, reality of life beyond this earth. So it's been helpful to people who are enduring their own seasons of sorrow, maybe particularly to help people who have suffered the loss of a child. And I think a couple of takeaways from the release of the book and the months and interviews that have followed is there's a lot of commonality in our sorrows. And so none of us gets through this life unscathed. All of us suffer in various ways and in many ways. And there's a lot of overlap between the loss of a child and the loss of our health, or the loss of a loved one and the loss of a job. There's just sorrow is sorrow, and a lot of the ways we process it is the same. And so somebody who's going through a loss can read a book about suffering in any of these ways and probably benefit from it. And then just reaffirming, I think, just how much we need to ponder God's sovereignty in our losses. That if we truly believe that God is sovereign, as sure would be your conviction of mine, God is sovereign in our election, God is sovereign in our salvation, God is also sovereign in life and death. And so when we even endure a tragedy, somehow we just have to know and affirm and believe that somewhere, somehow, God is involved in this. And that brings great meaning and great significance to our suffering, that God's got blessings for us in it. God's got a task and a duty for us to carry out in it. And so we ought to receive it from his hand and say, I may not understand why you've assigned this to me, but I trust you, I believe in you, and I'm going to just work this out in love to you and in service to your people, and just press on by faith.
Something you just said there. I wonder if you might speak a little bit more to for your own heart and your own experience. How much does seeking to understand why, how does that relate to your ability to worship the Lord in spite of? Do you find yourself still at this point of your journey? You still find yourself seeking out questions of why and how come? How do those questions relate to your ability to worship and trust in the midst of that?
Yeah, I'm not really interested in the why questions. I don't really anticipate God would answer that. And even if he did, I don't know that I really would have the mind or the maturity to be okay with it. So what if God came back and said, "Oh, here's why I did it. I did it so this person could hear the gospel and be saved." Am I supposed to then say, oh, well, good. I guess that works out.
Right.
God isn't in the business of answering a lot of our questions. He doesn't answer the question of why he chose to save you or me before the foundations of the earth, just because that's who he is. That's what he chose to do. God is love. God is good. And we just trust him. He doesn't owe us the answers. And I don't think he owes us the answers as to why our loved ones live and die. We just have to trust him. And so if we're going to trust God with our souls, we're going to trust him with our salvation and our, trust him all the way to death and trust him to new life beyond. We need to trust him with all the events in this world as well. And just really, really believe that God is up to something good in this world. We may not see it now. We may have to wait until heaven to see all that God is doing. But I really trust and believe that we will. And in that day, we'll say, God has done well. God has done something very, very good. So our task now is to just shift ourselves to the future, to live in that future, in a sense that even though I can't see it now, I can profess God has done no wrong. In fact, God has done something good and glorious. I just have to believe that. And that doesn't make our sorrow go away. It doesn't make us less sad,
Right.
but it does amplify our joy and it does amplify our faith. And so very early, we decided we're going to distinguish between why God did it and how God is using it. We're not going to get all hung up on the why God did it questions, but we will give him praise and glory for every evidence we see of how he's using it.
Well, that's good. That's really good. Were there a couple of books that were particularly helpful for you, or for you was it more of you're just reading the scripture and you're writing your way through your own sorrow, or were there a couple of books that you did find that were most helpful for you?
Yeah, I went back in time to a time when the loss of a child was common rather than rare.
Yeah.
And that took me back to the 1800s. And I found authors like F.B. Meyer, J.R. Miller, Theodore Cuyler, all these reformed pastors, theologians from a different era, but men whose ministry and often their own lives was really consumed with helping parents through this grief. And I just found tremendous, tremendous comfort from them. And at one point, I took the time just to go through Christian history and just find all these people who had suffered the loss of a child.
Wow.
So many of the great theologians, great missionaries, the people we look up to in history, these are people who suffered this very loss. And so that gave me a real sense of communion that
Wow.
that these people, look, their ministry wasn't over when they lost a child. Look, their joy did not end when they lost a child. They pressed on. Um, they pressed on in love to God and in service to other people. And then their sorrow came to an end when they went off to be with the Lord. And so I can press on as they did.
Yeah. So, and that's a great real life way of how reading and history and a knowledge of what God has done before us kind of merge, not just your hobby and ministry, but your real life sanctification of walking this journey with the Lord, to look back and
Yeah.
see people have been through that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, absolutely. And being able to find friends who have lived and died ages ago, to be able to spend time with them in their books, this was a precious, precious gift to me. And I'm just so thankful that even though dead, they speak. They left us this great legacy of their books. And really, some of my best friends in that year were people I won't ever meet until we're together in paradise.
Yeah. That's good. That's good. One last question, Tim, just on a personal side. Do you consider yourself, are you a reader who writes? Are you a writer who reads, or is it just an altogether bad question because you can't separate the two?
Good question. I would say I'm a writer who reads. I enjoy both, and they really do go together. They're complementary disciplines. I don't know that there's many good writers who aren't also committed readers. And often when I'm going dry, I'm just feeling like I don't have anything to say. I've reminded my wife and encouraged her many times, when you hear me grumbling about that, just say, "Hey, dummy, go read some books." That's always what gets you going again. And she's absolutely right. I just forget it. And so writing fuels the reading and reading fuels the writing. So, but I would say if people ask me what I am, I'll say I'm a writer, not I'm a reader. One of these is vocational, the other is complementary.
Right, right. Very good. Well, thank you so much, Tim, for a few minutes of your time. It's been very helpful and encouraging. And And thank you for your ministry and the way that you've served the body of Christ. I'm glad the Lord's chosen in His sovereignty to take what you were doing just kind of for yourself, and then in His goodness allow it to be used very widely for a fuller audience. And thanks for being faithful to what He's called you to do.
Thank you.
All right, blessings to you.